North Atlantic, May 1941, 12:42 hours, wind force 7. The sea was a moving wall of slate and teeth. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner surfaced into a world of knives. The cold cut through his uniform as if the wool were smoke. His lungs burned from chlorine-laced air. The Atlantic slapped him sideways and stole his breath. U-boat U-274, his command for the past 14 months, was no longer a boat so much as a shadow tilting out of the water, exhaling one final gout of oil before the bow knifed down, slow, stubborn, then gone. Men bobbed where steel had been moments ago. Shouts, whistles, a prayer half-spoken and swallowed by wind. 33 of 46. He counted without thinking, the way a captain always counts, by heads, by voices, by absences. Hoffman, the machinist, face gray as winter rope. Peltz, the torpedo chief, swearing through blue lips. Weiss, the radio man, 19, still clutching a message satchel that contained nothing of use now. Salt had already claimed the ink. The rest were down there, entombed with the cracked batteries and the bent dive planes, in a compartment that would fill and hush and keep its secrets forever. A gray shape carved across the whitecaps. A destroyer. Low, fast, predatory. British. Brenner had studied her kind from silhouettes and rumors. Knifed bow, raked funnels, a deck gun that could unmake a man at 1,000 meters. He knew the drill. Depth charges had lifted U-274 out of the black and buckled something vital in the stern. He had ordered the emergency blow. He had ordered the scuttling charges set. He had ordered abandon ship. And now the sea, indifferent judge that it was, had convened the final hearing. The stories were not subtle. Britain strangled by submarines, merchant sailors dead in the dark with no time for boats, no time for names. Retaliation was simple arithmetic. You drown ours, we drown yours. Officers whispered it with a shrug. Propagandists shouted it with glee. Machine guns on deck. Short bursts. Clean ledger. "Keep the men together," Brenner barked, the command shredded by wind. Waves tilted him until the sky was nothing but a dirty strip. Oil slick burned his eyes. Salt burned everything else. The destroyer canted, turned broadside, then eased back, her screws thrumming like a heartbeat inside the sea. On the bridge, binoculars flashed. A gun crew pivoted, practiced and unhurried. The barrel's black mouth found the ruin where U-274 had been, then wandered, almost lazily, onto the drifting German cluster. Brenner felt the old training argue with the new terror. He straightened in the water as if a parade square had suddenly spread beneath him. If this was the accounting, he would meet it standing. His instructor had said years ago, "Eyes front. Whatever comes, you keep your eyes front." A squall gusted. Spray veiled the destroyer. When the air cleared, the gun hadn't fired. Instead, movement at the rail. Figures running, not to the guns, but to the lifelines. Coils of rope arced outward like thrown questions. Cork life rings splashed near enough to slap his shoulder. A voice rose, German, careful and accented, amplified by a speaking trumpet that turned it strangely intimate across the distance. "Greifen Sie die Leinen, grab the lines, we are hauling you in." For a heartbeat, the words did not compute. Hoffman blinked. Peltz swore a different oath. Young Weiss stared at the ring bobbing at his chest as though it were a trick, the sea's cruel joke. On the destroyer's waist, sailors were already climbing down rope ladders, boots drumming against the hull as they descended toward the same black water that tried to take the Germans whole. Brenner's hands moved before his mind did. The ring was rough and blessedly solid. He locked his elbows through it and felt the line draw tight, a tug toward the unthinkable. The Atlantic, relentless judge, did not soften, but the men on it somehow had. "Hold on," the voice called again, closer now. "One at a time, you're coming aboard." Brenner lifted his chin, salt on his tongue, the destroyer swelling larger, the ladder slapping the swell. He had been told a story about how this would end. The sea and the men on it were telling him another.
The destroyer loomed above them like a steel cliff. Waves slammed its hull. Spray washed across its gun barrels. Brenner expected the rattle of machine gun fire at any second. Instead, he saw shapes, sailors leaning over the rails, shouting, tossing ropes. A British petty officer climbed halfway down a rope ladder, shouting through the wind, "Hold tight, lads, one at a time." He spoke English, but slowly, carefully, as if he wanted them to understand. The words floated across the waves, absurd in their kindness. Hoffman was the first to move. He kicked toward the ladder, nearly swallowed by a swell, grabbed the lowest rung and disappeared upward into the gray belly of the ship. Two sailors hauled him in, wrapping him in something white. Towels? Blankets? It didn't make sense. Then Peltz followed. Weiss next, still clutching his useless satchel. The boy's face was the color of chalk, lips trembling blue. When his head finally cleared the rail, the sailors clapped him on the back, guiding him inside. Brenner hesitated. Leadership had always meant being last off the boat, last in line for food, last to sleep. He watched the ladder slap the water again, the rope twisting like a live thing. His hands barely obeyed him. His fingers were stiff, nails pale as ice. The petty officer reached down, grabbed Brenner's wrist, and hauled. The world narrowed to motion, boots on metal, water streaming from uniforms, hands pulling, voices shouting above the wind. Then warmth, a corridor, light bulbs swinging, steam hissing from pipes. The air smelled of oil and coffee. He collapsed against a bulkhead, lungs heaving. The same enemy navy he had hunted for months was now dragging his crew out of the Atlantic one by one. A medic crouched beside him, cutting the wet fabric from his arms with surgical scissors. Another man pressed a mug into his hands. "Drink this." Hot, sweet, unfamiliar. Tea. Brenner blinked at the absurdity of it. The liquid burned his throat, yet he drank, every swallow waking a different piece of him that the sea had tried to take. "Why?" he rasped, finally. The medic looked up, puzzled. "Why rescue us?" The man frowned slightly, as if the question itself were strange. "Because you're sailors. Ship's gone. That's the end of it." Brenner stared at him. No accusation, no gloating, no anger. Just a fact, like weather. Around them, British crew moved with mechanical precision, recording names, distributing blankets, checking pulses. No one looked at the Germans with hatred. It was as if the fight outside the ship no longer existed once the men were in its hull. He caught Weiss's eye across the compartment. The young radio man's lips moved soundlessly. "They don't hate us." Brenner couldn't answer. He could only nod faintly, the warmth creeping into his bones and confusion deeper than the sea pressing in around him. Outside, the North Atlantic kept roaring. Inside, British hands poured tea for the men they had just fought. The war, Brenner realized, might still rage everywhere else, but here, inside this ship, something older than hatred had taken command. Above the muffled hum of engines, the HMS Resolute still rolled with the rhythm of the dying storm. On her deck, British sailors were coiling wet ropes and staring out toward the dark patch where U-274 had gone under. Oil still spread in slow circles, a black halo marking where steel had met its grave. Commander Edward Mallory, the ship's captain, stood at the bridge wing with binoculars glued to his face. The German submarine had surfaced only minutes before surrender, crippled by depth charges, and there was still a chance, a small one, that it hadn't sunk completely. Mallory's eyes caught something, the tip of the conning tower, a flash of metal rolling beneath the waves like the back of a dying whale. He lowered the glasses. "Still afloat, sir," said his first officer. "She's not gone yet." Mallory nodded slowly. "Then she's ours to board." Orders rippled through the destroyer. A motor whaler was lowered into the water, its oarsmen already soaked from the spray. 8 volunteers climbed in, carrying lines, crowbars, and canvas satchels. None needed to be told why this mattered. In the past year, Royal Navy intelligence had whispered about German encryption machines, Enigma, devices said to make U-boat communications unbreakable. If any of that gear survived inside U-274, it could shorten the war by months, maybe years. But to reach it, they would have to board a sinking coffin. The whaler approached cautiously, the sea slamming at its sides. When it drew alongside the submarine, the men could see the damage: torn plating, shattered glass, acid from ruptured batteries eating through paint. Steam hissed faintly from vents. The boarding party climbed onto the slick deck, boots sliding on oil. "Keep your eyes open for booby traps," warned Chief Petty Officer Langley, who led the team. "They like to scuttle their boats before we can blink." They pried open the conning tower hatch. A cloud of chlorine-tainted air burst out. Coughing, eyes watering, Langley descended first with a flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom. Hanging wires, overturned stools, water rising inch by inch through the control room. Every sound was amplified. The creak of hull metal, the hiss of leaks, the groan of something deep and shifting. Then the light caught a shape. The radio room, intact. On a table lay a typewriter-like device of black metal and brass rotors. Next to it, a small box filled with paper pads and codebooks, edges already damp. Langley's voice, hoarse with excitement. "We've got it! Christ almighty, we've actually got it!" They worked fast, passing up equipment through the hatch. Charts, logs, the Enigma machine itself dripping with seawater. Mallory watched from the bridge as the whaler harried the finds back, faces pale but triumphant. 15 minutes later, the submarine's bow rose briefly, then dipped again. A low groan, a shudder through the sea, and U-274 slid beneath for the last time, taking her remaining secrets down into the black. On HMS Resolute, drenched sailors hauled the recovered gear onto the deck. Mallory looked down at the rescued Germans, still huddled under blankets, oblivious to the value of what had just been taken from their ship. They were alive because he'd chosen mercy. Yet that same mercy had delivered Britain a victory more profound than any torpedo. He turned to his signal officer. "Get those materials locked up. Absolute secrecy. Not a word to anyone." The officer saluted. "Aye, sir." Mallory took one last glance at the dark horizon. The sea, ever impartial, gave nothing back. Not the men, not the machines, not the truth. Only silence, heavy as duty. By dawn, the storm had softened to a drizzle. A gray, exhausted light slid across the deck of HMS Resolute, revealing what the night had spared. 32 Germans, half frozen, half conscious, sat wrapped in wool blankets, steam rising from their clothes as the ship's heating system finally pushed back the chill. They looked more like shipwrecked fishermen than enemies of the crown. Some stared blankly at the sea. Others held tin mugs in shaking hands. A British sailor moved among them with a kettle, refilling each cup with hot, milky tea. The same ritual repeated over and over. Pour, nod, move on, as if kindness itself had been written into orders. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, still trembling from hypothermia, watched it all from where he sat against a bulkhead. The petty officer who'd pulled him aboard knelt again, checking his pulse with professional calm. "Better?" the man asked in slow, careful English. Brenner managed a nod. I thought you would shoot us." The petty officer gave a faint smile. "Not when you're in the water, sir. That's when the fighting's done." The words landed heavier than Brenner expected. His throat tightened. He had commanded attacks that sent British sailors to the bottom of this same sea, watched flames swallow merchant ships, heard men screaming through hydrophones before the noise faded into static. Now he was being handed a blanket by those same hands. Nearby, Weiss, the 19-year-old radio man, sat beside a British gunner twice his size. The gunner offered him a cigarette, striking the match with exaggerated slowness so the boy could lean in. They smoked in silence. Two men who hours earlier had been trying to kill each other, now sharing the same breath. Below decks, Commander Mallory dictated his report. His tone was clipped, factual. Enemy submarine engaged and forced to surface. Crew rescued per maritime law. Intelligence materials recovered prior to sinking. No rhetoric, no triumph, just procedure. Mercy treated as paperwork. At midday, the prisoners were issued dry uniforms, old Royal Navy overalls, stamped POW in black paint. Medical staff recorded names and injuries. No interrogations, no shouting, just the mechanical rhythm of professionalism. When Brenner was led below to the temporary quarters, he passed a sign on a watertight door. "Keep Sea Law." He didn't understand the phrase, but the British seemed to live by it. Hours later, as the ship turned toward Scapa Flow, Brenner lay in a bunk too clean for him, listening to the low thrum of the engines. Through the steel, he could faintly hear laughter from the British mess, a sound neither cruel nor celebratory, merely human. He closed his eyes. The propaganda posters that had papered every wall back home, depicting the Englishman as a brute, a hypocrite, a torturer, peeled away in his mind like wet paint. Maybe war was not about nations, he thought. Maybe it was about how men behaved after the fighting stopped. Above decks, HMS Resolute cut east through calm water, her wake curling over the place where U-274 slept. The same Atlantic that had tried to kill them now carried both hunter and hunted home.
By the time HMS Resolute reached Scapa Flow, the rescued Germans had become ghosts within their own story. They were alive, yes, fed, clothed, counted, but every British sailor on board had been warned, say nothing. Commander Mallory's standing order was absolute. U-274, he told his officers in a low voice, never existed, not officially. These men were picked up from the sea after an unspecified engagement. The submarine sank with all hands. Do you understand? They understood perfectly. The Enigma machine and codebooks recovered from U-274 now rested in a locked steel chest under armed watch. 2 signalmen had already been flown south with sealed crates for Bletchley Park. Whatever those boxes contained could rewrite the war. Secrecy was not caution, it was survival. Meanwhile, below deck, the Germans remained unaware of what had truly been taken from them. Their personal items were catalogued, their names logged in quiet handwriting. Guards were polite, distant. No taunts, no threats. Brenner sat in the mess compartment, writing in a small notebook salvaged from his pocket. The paper was still damp, the pencil dull. He recorded the names of the dead, a ritual more than a duty. Hofmann, Peltz, Wendt. 32 survived, 15 gone. He would send the list when allowed, if allowed. Weiss approached hesitantly, holding a biscuit tin the British had given him. "They call this shortbread, Herr Kapitän," he said softly, as though speaking the word itself might offend someone. Brenner smiled without meaning to. "And what do you call it?" he asked. Weiss replied, "A miracle." Up on the bridge, Mallory watched gray islands rise from the sea mist. His logbook entry remained precise, stripped of emotion. Enemy submarine boarded, cryptographic materials secured, survivors to be processed under POW regulations, casualties, none among boarding party. He closed the book and leaned on the rail. The young British sailor beside him, barely 20, asked, "Sir, if it's all secret, what'll the papers say?" Mallory didn't look at him. "They'll say we sank her. That's all they need." That night, the destroyer's lights burned dim. The sea was calm, almost kind. Somewhere deep in the ship, Brenner dreamed of the ladder swinging over the water, the moment he'd reached for the rope, expecting bullets, finding rescue. He woke with the echo of it still in his hands. When dawn came, Scapa Flow opened before them. Gray bays lined with anchored ships, a fortress of steel and routine. The Germans were transferred to a transport vessel under heavy guard, but the guards still helped them down the gangway, one by one, steadying their footing as if escorting guests rather than prisoners. Brenner glanced back at HMS Resolute, its flag snapping in the wind. Somewhere inside that ship, his Enigma machine, his pride, his secret, was already being studied by men who spoke a language he couldn't understand. He felt no hatred, only a strange, hollow respect. The British had taken his boat, his freedom, and his silence, but not his dignity. And perhaps, he thought, they had saved something else too, his understanding of what civilization was supposed to mean.
The journey south to the internment camp in Lancashire took 3 days. Rain drummed on the roof of the transport train as it wound through a countryside too green, too peaceful for men who'd lived beneath the ocean. At every stop, British soldiers offered water, food, even cigarettes, not as gestures of kindness, but as matters of procedure. The precision of it unsettled Brenner more than hostility ever could. He remembered the British petty officer's words aboard Resolute. "That's when the fighting's done." The phrase had followed him ever since, 6 words that seemed to govern an invisible moral order. When they arrived, the camp gate swung open not onto barbed cruelty, but into order. Wooden huts, gravel paths, a canteen that smelled faintly of stew. The sign at the entrance read simply, "Prisoner of War Camp Number 178, Geneva Convention observed." Inside, guards moved with an almost bureaucratic detachment. Brenner and his crew were assigned bunks, issued wool uniforms marked POW, and briefed on camp routines. Roll call at 0700, meals at fixed hours, letters home allowed once per month under censorship. It felt like military life, stripped of purpose, but not of structure. The first night, Brenner sat with Weiss and 2 other survivors in the barracks' quiet glow. Rain pattered against the tin roof. The young radio man was turning over his new blanket as though trying to find the hidden cruelty inside it. "They treat us like," Weiss hesitated, "like people." Brenner nodded. That may be the point. Weeks turned to months. Routine softened suspicion. The Germans were given work, tending gardens, repairing fences, clearing snow. Food was plain but adequate. No torture, no interrogations beyond the formal questions: name, rank, number. The medical officer, a thin Scotsman with an expression of eternal disapproval, treated frostbite and fever without comment on nationality. The cruelty Brenner expected never arrived. In its absence, something heavier replaced it: reflection. One evening, a chaplain visited the camp to conduct an English service. The guards didn't object when some Germans lingered nearby, curious. Brenner stood among them,
not understanding the words, but catching the rhythm of them, solemn, restrained, almost scientific in their mercy. Love thy enemy. He thought of the British sailors hauling his men from the sea, of the tea pressed into frozen hands, of the strange, instinctive decency that seemed older than the war itself. It was then he began to grasp what the British called the law of the sea, that ancient unspoken rule binding mariners of all nations. Once a man is in the water, he is no longer enemy, but fellow sailor. This wasn't sentimentality, it was professionalism, a code deeper than propaganda, older than nations. Years later, when Brenner would tell his story in fragments to his own son, he would describe that law as the moment civilization proved stronger than hate. But for now, in the stillness of a foreign camp, it was simply the sound of rain on a roof and the faint echo of voices across a sea that no longer wanted to kill him.
The destroyer loomed above them like a steel cliff. Waves slammed its hull. Spray washed across its gun barrels. Brenner expected the rattle of machine gun fire at any second. Instead, he saw shapes, sailors leaning over the rails, shouting, tossing ropes. A British petty officer climbed halfway down a rope ladder, shouting through the wind, "Hold tight, lads, one at a time." He spoke English, but slowly, carefully, as if he wanted them to understand. The words floated across the waves, absurd in their kindness. Hoffman was the first to move. He kicked toward the ladder, nearly swallowed by a swell, grabbed the lowest rung and disappeared upward into the gray belly of the ship. Two sailors hauled him in, wrapping him in something white. Towels? Blankets? It didn't make sense. Then Peltz followed. Weiss next, still clutching his useless satchel. The boy's face was the color of chalk, lips trembling blue. When his head finally cleared the rail, the sailors clapped him on the back, guiding him inside. Brenner hesitated. Leadership had always meant being last off the boat, last in line for food, last to sleep. He watched the ladder slap the water again, the rope twisting like a live thing. His hands barely obeyed him. His fingers were stiff, nails pale as ice. The petty officer reached down, grabbed Brenner's wrist, and hauled. The world narrowed to motion, boots on metal, water streaming from uniforms, hands pulling, voices shouting above the wind. Then warmth, a corridor, light bulbs swinging, steam hissing from pipes. The air smelled of oil and coffee. He collapsed against a bulkhead, lungs heaving. The same enemy navy he had hunted for months was now dragging his crew out of the Atlantic one by one. A medic crouched beside him, cutting the wet fabric from his arms with surgical scissors. Another man pressed a mug into his hands. "Drink this." Hot, sweet, unfamiliar. Tea. Brenner blinked at the absurdity of it. The liquid burned his throat, yet he drank, every swallow waking a different piece of him that the sea had tried to take. "Why?" he rasped, finally. The medic looked up, puzzled. "Why rescue us?" The man frowned slightly, as if the question itself were strange. "Because you're sailors. Ship's gone. That's the end of it." Brenner stared at him. No accusation, no gloating, no anger. Just a fact, like weather. Around them, British crew moved with mechanical precision, recording names, distributing blankets, checking pulses. No one looked at the Germans with hatred. It was as if the fight outside the ship no longer existed once the men were in its hull. He caught Weiss's eye across the compartment. The young radio man's lips moved soundlessly. "They don't hate us." Brenner couldn't answer. He could only nod faintly, the warmth creeping into his bones and confusion deeper than the sea pressing in around him. Outside, the North Atlantic kept roaring. Inside, British hands poured tea for the men they had just fought. The war, Brenner realized, might still rage everywhere else. But here, inside this ship, something older than hatred had taken command.